The alarm clock rang at 5 in the morning, just like it had for the past 15 years. Staff Sergeant David Thompson rolled out of bed with the same discipline that had carried him through 3 tours in Afghanistan. But today was different. Today, he wasn't getting ready for another day at the military base or even his current job at the defense contractor's office. Today, he was getting ready to walk into a federal courthouse and tell the truth about something that could destroy careers and send people to prison. David stood in front of his bedroom mirror, carefully putting on his dress uniform. Each button, each crease, each detail had to be perfect. This wasn't just about looking good. This uniform represented something bigger than himself. It represented every soldier he had served with, every mission they had completed together, and every brother and sister who didn't make it home. His wife, Patricia, watched from the doorway. She had seen him put on this uniform dozens of times over the years, but never for something like this. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft with worry. "You know what this could mean for us, for your job, for everything." David paused as he attached his bronze star to his chest. The weight of the medal always surprised him, not because it was heavy, but because of what it represented. He had earned it during his second deployment when his convoy was attacked by enemy fighters. While under fire, he had pulled 3 wounded soldiers to safety, carrying them one by one across 50 yards of open ground. The medal wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a reminder of the worst and best day of his military career. "I have to do this," David said, adjusting his Purple Heart next to the Bronze Star. That medal told a different story, about the day shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had torn through his left shoulder. He still felt the pain sometimes, especially when it rained. "If I don't speak up, who will? Those contractors are stealing money that should be going to our troops. Money that could save lives." The drive to the courthouse took 40 minutes, but it felt like hours. David's mind kept going back to 6 months ago, when he first discovered the problem. He was working as a logistics coordinator for Blackstone Defense Solutions, one of the biggest military contractors in the country. His job was simple: make sure equipment and supplies got to the right places at the right times. It was the kind of work that came naturally to him after years in the Army. But something wasn't adding up in the paperwork. Invoices for equipment that never arrived. Payments for services that were never provided. Purchase orders for supplies that cost 3 times what they should have. At first, David thought it was just poor record keeping. Military contractors weren't always known for their organization. But the more he dug, the more he realized this wasn't sloppy paperwork. This was deliberate fraud. The company was billing the government millions of dollars for things that didn't exist. They were charging premium prices for basic equipment. They were claiming to deliver supplies to forward operating bases that had been closed for years. And worst of all, they were doing it with money that was supposed to be protecting American soldiers. David had tried to handle it quietly at first. He went to his supervisor, a man named Johnson who had hired him when he left the Army. Johnson listened to David's concerns and promised to look into it. But weeks went by and nothing changed. The fraudulent invoices kept coming. The fake purchase orders kept getting approved. The money kept flowing out of the Defense Department and into Blackstone's accounts. That's when David made the hardest decision of his civilian career. He called the FBI. The federal investigation took months. David had to provide documents, recordings, and testimony to prove the fraud was happening. He had to wear a wire to record conversations with his co-workers. He had to copy files and take pictures of evidence, always worried that someone would catch him and his cover would be blown. The stress was enormous. David found himself waking up in the middle of the night, wondering if he was doing the right thing. These were people he worked with every day. Some of them had become friends. But every time he doubted himself, he thought about the soldiers who were still serving overseas, depending on equipment and supplies that might not be there when they needed them most. The FBI agents who worked with David were impressed by his dedication to getting the truth out. Agent Rodriguez, the lead investigator, told David that his evidence was some of the best they had ever seen in a defense contractor fraud case. "You're not just a witness," Rodriguez had said. "You're the key to this entire case. Without your testimony, these people walk free." Now, as David walked up the courthouse steps, he could feel the weight of that responsibility. The building was massive, with tall columns and steps that seemed to go on forever. Inside, the hallways were filled with lawyers, reporters, and other people involved in various cases. David had never been in a federal courthouse before, and he was struck by how serious everything felt. His lawyer, Ms. Chen, met him in the lobby. She was a prosecutor with the Department of Justice, and she had been working with David for months to prepare for this day. "Ready for this?" she asked, shaking his hand. "As ready as I'll ever be," David replied. He could feel his heart beating faster as they walked toward the courtroom. "Remember," Ms. Chen said as they stopped outside the courtroom doors. "Just tell the truth. That's all we need from you. Your service record speaks for itself. Your evidence speaks for itself. Just be honest about what you saw and what you know." David nodded and straightened his uniform one more time. The medals on his chest caught the light from the courthouse windows. Each one told a story of service, sacrifice, and honor. Today he was adding a new chapter to that story. Today he was serving his country in a different way, but with the same commitment to doing what was right. As he pushed open the courtroom doors, David had no idea that in just a few minutes everything would change. He had no idea that his uniform, his medals, and his service would become the center of a controversy that would end his career and change his life forever. All he knew was that he had a job to do, and he was going to do it with the same honor and integrity that had guided him through 15 years of military service. The courtroom was packed with people. Lawyers, reporters, family members of the defendants, and other witnesses filled every seat. David walked down the center aisle toward the witness stand, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, but he kept his focus straight ahead. This was his moment to serve his country once again. He just didn't know how much it was going to cost him. David walked into the courtroom feeling confident. He had practiced his testimony dozens of times with the prosecutor. He knew the evidence inside and out. He was ready to tell the truth about what he had seen at Blackstone Defense Solutions. But as he looked around the packed courtroom, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Judge Harold Morrison sat behind the bench like a king on his throne. The man was in his late 60s with silver hair and a face that looked like it had never smiled. His black robe seemed to make him look even more intimidating. David had heard about Judge Morrison from other people at the courthouse. Some called him fair but strict. Others whispered that he had old-fashioned ideas about how things should be done. The defendants sat at their table on the left side of the courtroom. 3 executives from Blackstone Defense Solutions, all wearing expensive suits and looking like they owned the place. David recognized them from the office. There was Peterson, the CEO who drove a different luxury car to work every day. Next to him sat Williams, the CFO who had signed off on most of the fraudulent invoices. And finally, there was Martinez, the contracts manager who had personally approved payments for equipment that never existed. These men had become millionaires by stealing from the American military. They had bought mansions, yachts, and vacation homes with money that should have gone to protecting soldiers. Now they sat there looking calm and confident, like they didn't have a care in the world. The prosecutor, Ms. Chen, called David to the witness stand. As he stood up and walked forward, he could hear his medals gently clicking together with each step. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, his service ribbons, they were all there, displayed on his uniform with pride. This was how he had always appeared at official military functions, and it felt right to wear them today while serving his country in this new way. But as David approached the witness stand, Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. "Stop right there, Sergeant." David froze in the middle of the courtroom. Every eye was on him. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his eyes focused on David's uniform. "What exactly do you think this is, Sergeant? A military parade?" David felt confused. He looked over at Ms. Chen, who seemed just as surprised as he was. "Your Honor," David said, not sure what the judge was getting at. "Those medals on your chest," Judge Morrison said, pointing with his gavel. "This is a civilian court, not a military ceremony. I will not have my courtroom turned into some kind of political theater." The words hit David like a physical blow. Political theater? These medals weren't about politics. They were about service, sacrifice, fee on the line for his country. "Your Honor," Ms. Chen stood up from the prosecutor's table. "Sergeant Thompson is appearing in his official capacity as a military veteran and government witness. His uniform and decorations are appropriate for these proceedings." Judge Morrison's face turned red. "I'll decide what's appropriate in my courtroom, Counselor." Sergeant, I'm ordering you to remove those medals immediately. This is a court of law, not a military base. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had worn his uniform to citizenship ceremonies, Memorial Day events, and military funerals. No one had ever asked him to remove his medals. They were part of who he was, part of his identity as a soldier who had served his country with honor. Your Honor, David said, his voice steady despite the shock he was feeling. These medals represent my service to our country. I earned them through my actions in combat. They're not political statements. They're symbols of my oath to defend the Constitution. The judge's eyes narrowed. Are you refusing to follow my order, Sergeant? David felt like he was standing at a crossroads. On one side was his duty to testify against the contractors who had stolen from the military. On the other side was his dignity as a veteran and his right to wear the symbols of his service. He thought about all the soldiers he had served with, especially the ones who didn't make it home. Would they want him to remove his medals? Would they want him to hide his service? Your Honor, David said carefully, I'm asking you to reconsider. These medals are authorized for wear during official proceedings. I'm not trying to disrespect your court. I'm trying to honor the oath I swore to serve my country. The judge slammed his gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. I will not be lectured about honor by someone who can't follow simple instructions. You have 30 seconds to remove those medals, or I'll hold you in contempt of court and have you arrested. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. Some people looked shocked. Others seemed angry. David could see reporters in the gallery frantically taking notes. Several people had their phones out, and he realized they were probably recording the whole thing. Ms. Chen tried one more time. Your Honor, I respectfully request that you reconsider. Sergeant Thompson has every right to wear his military decorations while testifying about his service to his country. Counselor, you have 20 seconds to control your witness, or I'll have him removed from my courtroom, Judge Morrison shot back. David looked around the room and saw something that broke his heart. In the gallery, he spotted several other veterans who had come to support him. One was an older man in a wheelchair, probably a Vietnam veteran. Another was a young woman who looked like she had recently returned from deployment. They were all watching him, waiting to see what he would do. He thought about his wife Patricia sitting at home and probably watching the news coverage of the trial. He thought about his unit in Afghanistan, the soldiers he had served with who had trusted him with their lives. He thought about the 3 men he had saved to earn his Bronze Star, and how they had thanked him for not giving up on them. 15 seconds. Sergeant, the judge said coldly. David made his decision. He looked directly at Judge Morrison and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried across the entire courtroom. Your Honor, with all due respect, I cannot and will not remove these medals. They represent the blood, sweat, and sacrifice of every soldier I've served with. They represent my brothers and sisters who didn't come home. They represent the oath I swore to defend the Constitution of the United States, which includes the right to religious freedom, free speech, and equal treatment under the law. The judge's face was now bright red with anger. Bailiff, arrest this man for contempt of court. As the bailiff started moving toward David, something unexpected happened. The veteran in the wheelchair started clapping. Then the young woman veteran joined in. Soon half the courtroom was applauding David's stand. But David wasn't done talking. Your Honor, he said, his voice now carrying over the applause, I'll remove these medals under protest. But I want everyone in this room to know that I'm doing it because I believe in the law, not because I believe you're right. With steady hands, David began removing his medals one by one. He started with his Bronze Star, holding it up so everyone could see it before placing it carefully on the witness stand. Then came his Purple Heart, followed by his service ribbons and unit citations. As each medal was removed, the courtroom grew quieter. People could see that this wasn't just about following a judge's order. This was about a man being forced to choose between his dignity and his duty. When David had finished removing all his medals, he looked back at Judge Morrison. I followed your order, Your Honor, but I want the record to show that justice wears many uniforms, and today you've dishonored one of them. The room was completely silent now. David stood there in his uniform, stripped of the symbols of his service, but somehow looking more dignified than ever. Judge Morrison, perhaps realizing that he had made a terrible mistake, tried to regain control of his courtroom. The witness will take the stand and be sworn in. But the damage was already done. In just a few minutes, Judge Morrison had turned a routine court proceeding into a national controversy. And for David, this was just the beginning of a battle that would cost him everything he had worked for in his civilian life. David stood at the witness stand, looking down at his medals scattered across the wooden surface. His bronze star caught the courtroom lights, creating small reflections that danced across the walls. For 15 years, these medals had been pinned to his chest with pride. Now they lay there like fallen soldiers, removed not by enemy fire, but by a judge who seemed to see them as nothing more than decorations. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, ready to arrest David for contempt. But something was happening in the courtroom that Judge Morrison hadn't expected. People were pulling out their phones, recording everything. The veteran in the wheelchair had tears in his eyes as he continued to clap slowly. The young female veteran was shaking her head in disbelief. Judge Morrison realized he was losing control of his courtroom. "Everyone put those phones away immediately," he shouted, banging his gavel repeatedly. "This is a court of law, not a circus." But it was too late. The damage was already being done. Videos of David removing his medals were already being uploaded to social media. The image of a decorated war veteran being forced to strip away his honors was spreading across the internet faster than wildfire. Ms. Chen, the prosecutor, stood up again. "Your Honor, I must object in the strongest possible terms. Sergeant Thompson has broken no laws and violated no court rules. His treatment here today is not only wrong, it's illegal under federal statutes that protect veterans' rights. Counselor, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt yourself," Judge Morrison warned. "Now sit down and let's proceed with this testimony." David looked out at the packed courtroom. He could see the defendants from Blackstone Defense Solutions smirking at their table. They were probably enjoying this whole scene, thinking it would distract from their own crimes. Peterson, the CEO, was actually whispering something to his lawyer and chuckling. That's when David realized something important. This wasn't really about his medals at all. This was about power. Judge Morrison was showing everyone in his courtroom that he had the power to humiliate anyone he wanted, even a decorated war veteran. The defendants were showing that they had enough money and influence to make the system work for them, even when they were clearly guilty. But David had power too. He had the power of truth. He had the power of his service record. And he had the power to choose how he would respond to this injustice. The bailiff was now standing right next to David, waiting for the judge's final order to make the arrest. David could feel the metal handcuffs brushing against his arm. In a few seconds, he would be led out of this courtroom in chains, just like a common criminal. That's when David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of letting himself be arrested quietly, David picked up his bronze star from the witness stand. He held it up high so everyone in the courtroom could see it. "This medal," David said in a loud, clear voice that carried to every corner of the room, "was earned on a battlefield in Afghanistan. I was part of a convoy that got hit by enemy fighters. 3 of my fellow soldiers were wounded and trapped in a burning vehicle. I ran across 50 yards of open ground under enemy fire 3 separate times to pull those men to safety." Judge Morrison was banging his gavel furiously. "Sergeant, you will be quiet immediately." But David kept talking. "One of those soldiers was a 19-year-old kid from Texas named Bobby Martinez. He had a picture of his girlfriend in his helmet that he showed everyone. He was going to marry her when he got home." David's voice cracked slightly. "Bobby lost his right leg in that attack, but he lived. He got to go home and marry that girl because I didn't give up on him." The courtroom was completely silent now, except for the judge's gavel. Even the defendants had stopped smirking. David picked up his Purple Heart. "This medal represents the day I almost didn't come home. An ID exploded next to our vehicle during a supply run. Shrapnel went through my shoulder and nearly severed an artery. I was bleeding out on the side of a road in a country most Americans can't fly. And on a map. But my medic didn't give up on me. My squad didn't give up on me. They carried me to safety and saved my life." "Bailiff, arrest this man immediately," Judge Morrison shouted. But something remarkable was happening. More people in the courtroom gallery were standing up. Not just the veterans, but regular citizens who understood that they were witnessing something important. A reporter from the local newspaper was writing furiously. A sketch artist was capturing the scene for the evening news. David continued, holding up his service ribbons one by one. "These ribbons represent 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, 15 years of service to my country, 15 years of getting up before dawn, following orders, serving something bigger than myself. I've been shot at, bombed, and threatened. I've seen friends die and watched families torn apart by war. The bailiff hesitated, looking back at the judge for confirmation. Even he seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. But you know what? David said, his voice getting stronger. I've never been as disappointed in my country as I am right now. Not when I was lying on that roadside bleeding. Not when I was under enemy fire. Not when I was carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Those were hard times, but they were honest times. We knew who the enemy was. Judge Morrison's face was now purple with rage. That's enough. Bailiff, I order you to arrest this man right now. David looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, you can arrest me. You can hold me in contempt. You can even throw me in jail. But you cannot take away what these medals represent. You cannot erase my service to this country. And you cannot stop me from telling the truth about what I saw at Blackstone Defense Solutions. The entire courtroom was on its feet now. People were cheering, clapping, and some were even crying. The veterans in the gallery were saluting David. The young woman veteran was shouting, "Hooah!" the Army battle cry that meant she supported him completely. But the most powerful moment came when David carefully placed each of his medals back on the witness stand and said something that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. Your Honor, I wore this uniform in combat zones where people were trying to kill me. I've worn it at military funerals where we buried heroes. I've worn it at ceremonies where we celebrated the best of what America represents. But I have never been more proud to wear it than I am right now, standing here in your courtroom, telling the truth about corruption and greed that's stealing from the soldiers who are still fighting for our freedom. The applause was thunderous. Judge Morrison was banging his gavel so hard that it looked like he might break it. The bailiff was looking around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. That's when Ms. Chen made a brilliant legal move. She stood up and addressed the court in a voice that cut through all the noise. Your Honor, I move for an immediate recess, so that this court can review the relevant federal statutes regarding veterans' rights and the appropriate protocols for their treatment in federal proceedings. It was a face-saving move for the judge. He could call a recess, consult with his law clerks, and hopefully realize the massive mistake he was making before it was too late. But Judge Morrison was too angry and too proud to take the exit ramp he was being offered. Motion denied. He shouted, "Bailiff, arrest Sergeant Thompson for contempt of court." As the handcuffs clicked around David's wrists, he looked back at the courtroom one more time. The phones were still recording. The reporters were still writing. The veterans were still standing and saluting. David had lost his freedom, at least temporarily. But he had won something more important. He had shown everyone in that room, and soon everyone in the country, what it meant to stand up for your principles even when it cost you everything. As he was led out of the courtroom, David could hear people chanting his name. But more importantly, he could see his medals still sitting on the witness stand, catching the light and reminding everyone who saw them that some things are more valuable than comfort, security, or even freedom. The fight for justice was just beginning. The jail cell was small, cold, and nothing like the barracks David had lived in during his military service. As he sat on the narrow metal bed, still wearing his dress uniform minus the medals, he had no idea that outside these walls, the entire country was talking about what had happened in Judge Morrison's courtroom. It started with a phone video taken by Maria Santos, a court reporter who had been covering trials for 20 years. She had never seen anything like what happened to David, so she live-streamed the entire confrontation on her social media account. Within an hour, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. Within 3 hours, it had reached 1 million views. The hashtag #RespectOurVeterans began trending on Twitter. People from all walks of life were sharing the video and expressing their outrage at how David had been treated. But it wasn't just random people on social media. Major news networks picked up the story. By evening, CNN ran a segment titled, "Judge Forces Veteran to Remove Medals." Fox News called it an attack on American heroes. MSNBC featured legal experts explaining how Judge Morrison had violated federal laws protecting veterans' rights. Even international news outlets covered the story, with the BBC running a piece about America's treatment of its war veterans. Back at his home, Patricia Thompson was watching the news coverage with a mixture of pride and terror. She was proud of her husband for standing up for what he believed in, but she was terrified about what this meant for their future. David's phone had been ringing nonstop with calls from reporters, veterans organizations, and politicians wanting to comment on the story. The most powerful response came from General Patricia Williams, the first African-American woman to achieve 4-star rank in the U.S. Army. She released a statement that was read on every major news network. Sergeant Thompson's treatment in that courtroom was not just an insult to him personally, but an insult to every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform of the United States military. His medals were earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. To force him to remove them was not just wrong, it was un-American. Veterans organizations across the country were mobilizing. The American Legion issued a statement calling for Judge Morrison's immediate removal from the bench. The veterans of foreign wars announced they were organizing protests outside federal courthouses in major cities. Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America started an online petition demanding justice for David that collected over 200,000 signatures in its first day. But the support wasn't just coming from military organizations. Civil rights groups saw David's treatment as part of a larger pattern of discrimination in the justice system. The NAACP issued a statement pointing out that African American veterans have historically faced additional challenges when returning from combat. And David's treatment was another example of that ongoing problem. College students organized rallies on campuses across the country. One particularly powerful demonstration took place at Ohio State University, where students laid out hundreds of replica military medals on the steps of the Student Union building. Each medal had the name of a veteran who had been discriminated against after returning from service. However, not everyone was supporting David. Some people argued that he should have just followed the judge's orders and removed his medals without making a scene. Conservative commentators suggested that David was being disrespectful to the court system and using his military service for political gain. Judge Morrison's supporters pointed out that federal judges have broad authority to control their courtrooms and that David had technically been in contempt of court when he refused to follow a direct order. Legal experts were divided on whether the judge had acted within his authority or had overstepped his bounds. The most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: David's employer. 3 days after the courtroom incident, David received a certified letter at the county jail where he was being held. Blackstone Defense Solutions had terminated his employment, effective immediately. The termination letter, signed by CEO Peterson himself, was brutal in its coldness. Due to your recent involvement in highly publicized legal proceedings that have brought negative attention to our company, and in accordance with the morality clause in your employment contract, we are terminating your employment effective immediately. Your actions have created a hostile work environment and damaged our company's reputation with our government clients. The irony was overwhelming. David was being fired by the same company he had been trying to expose for fraud. The same executives who had stolen millions from the military were now claiming that David's testimony was somehow damaging their reputation. Patricia Thompson read the termination letter with tears in her eyes. David had been the primary breadwinner in their family. They had a mortgage, car payments, and 2 children who would be starting college in the next few years. Without David's income, they would quickly face financial ruin. But the termination letter also did something that Blackstone's executives probably didn't expect. It made David a more sympathetic figure to the American public. Here was a decorated war veteran who had discovered fraud, reported it to the FBI, and was now being punished by the very people he had tried to expose. The story took on new dimensions when investigative reporters started digging into Blackstone Defense Solutions' background. They discovered that the company had been involved in several previous scandals, including overcharging the government for basic supplies and failing to deliver equipment to soldiers in combat zones. One particularly damaging report revealed that Blackstone had billed the government for delivering winter clothing to troops in Afghanistan, but the clothing was never shipped. American soldiers had spent an entire winter without proper cold weather gear, while Blackstone executives used the money to buy luxury cars and expensive vacations. The public outrage reached a new level when Gold Star families, parents who had lost children in combat, began speaking out in support of David. These families understood better than anyone what those medals represented and how sacred they were to the people who earned them. Linda Martinez, whose son had been killed by an IED in Iraq, appeared on national television wearing her son's Purple Heart. "This medal is all I have left of my boy," she said, crying. "It represents his sacrifice for this country. What that judge did to Sergeant Thompson was like spitting on my son's grave." The political response was swift and bipartisan. Republican Senator Johnson from Texas called for congressional hearings into David's treatment. Democratic Senator Rodriguez from California introduced legislation that would strengthen legal protections for veterans appearing in federal court. Even President Harrison, who rarely commented on individual legal cases, issued a statement through his press secretary. "Every American who has worn the uniform of our military deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. We are reviewing this situation carefully, but perhaps the most important development came from an unexpected source. Other employees at Blackstone Defense Solutions began coming forward with their own evidence of fraud and corruption. Inspired by David's courage, they were willing to risk their own jobs to tell the truth about what they had witnessed. A procurement specialist named Jennifer Walsh contacted the FBI with documents showing how the company had deliberately inflated prices for basic supplies. An accountant named Robert Chen provided spreadsheets proving that Blackstone had billed for services that were never performed. A quality control inspector named Amanda Foster revealed that the company had shipped defective equipment to military bases, knowing that it could fail when soldiers needed it most. The FBI investigation that had started with David's testimony was now becoming the largest defense contractor fraud case in U.S. history, but David himself was still sitting in a jail cell, wondering if he had made the right choice when he decided to stand up to Judge Morrison. On his 4th day in jail, David received a visitor. It wasn't his wife or his lawyer. It was Tommy Rodriguez, one of the soldiers David had saved in Afghanistan when he earned his Bronze Star. Tommy had lost his leg in that attack, but he had made the trip from Texas to visit David in jail. "Sergeant," Tommy said, his voice choked with emotion, "you saved my life once in Afghanistan. Now you're saving a lot more lives by exposing these thieves. Don't you dare think for 1 second that you made the wrong choice." As David looked at Tommy's prosthetic leg and thought about all the other soldiers who had been let down by companies like Blackstone, he knew that no matter what this cost him personally, he had made the right decision. The fight was far from over, but David Thompson was no longer fighting alone. 6 months later, David Thompson stood in front of another courtroom, but this time everything was different. He was wearing the same dress uniform and his medals were pinned exactly where they belonged, on his chest, gleaming under the courtroom lights. The judge sitting behind the bench was the Honorable Rebecca Martinez, a fair and respected jurist who had specifically requested to take over the Blackstone Defense Solutions case after Judge Morrison's removal. The journey to this moment had been long and difficult, but justice had finally found its way. Judge Morrison's downfall had come swiftly once the legal community began examining his actions. The Federal Judicial Council launched an investigation within a week of the viral courtroom incident. What they discovered was troubling. Morrison had a pattern of treating veterans, minorities, and other vulnerable groups with contempt and disrespect. The investigation revealed that Morrison had once ordered a disabled veteran to remove his service dog from the courtroom, claiming it was disruptive. He had made inappropriate comments about the immigration status of Hispanic witnesses. He had even questioned whether a female military officer was really qualified to testify about combat operations. The final straw came when legal scholars from Harvard Law School published a detailed analysis of Morrison's rulings over the past 10 years. They found a clear pattern of bias against veterans, especially Black and Hispanic veterans. The paper, titled "Justice Denied: Systemic Discrimination in Federal Court Proceedings," became required reading in law schools across the country. Within 3 months, Judge Morrison had been formally censured by the Federal Judicial Council and forced into early retirement. His pension was reduced and he was banned from serving as a visiting judge in any federal court. The man who had tried to humiliate a decorated war veteran had instead ended his own career in disgrace. But David's vindication went beyond just Morrison's punishment. The wrongful termination lawsuit against Blackstone Defense Solutions had turned into a legal earthquake that shook the entire defense contracting industry. David's lawyer, a brilliant civil rights attorney named Michael Foster, had built an airtight case. Not only had Blackstone violated David's rights as a whistleblower, but they had also retaliated against him for exposing their criminal behavior. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict in David's favor. The settlement amount was confidential, but court documents revealed it was substantial enough to ensure that David and his family would never have to worry about money again. More importantly, the settlement included provisions that would protect other whistleblowers in the future. The criminal case against Blackstone's executives had been even more satisfying. With David's original evidence and the testimony of the other employees who had been inspired to come forward, the prosecution had built a case that was impossible to defend against. Peterson, the CEO who had once laughed at David's humiliation in Morrison's courtroom, was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay back $30 million in stolen funds. Williams, the CFO, received 8 years and was banned from working for any government contractor ever again. Martinez, the contracts manager, got 6 years and had to forfeit his luxury home and yacht. But the most important outcome of the criminal case wasn't the prison sentences. It was the changes that were implemented across the entire defense contracting system. New oversight procedures were put in place to prevent fraud. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, and companies like Blackstone would now face regular audits to ensure they were delivering what they promised to the military. David used his settlement money to start the Thompson Foundation for Military Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting veterans who speak out against corruption and fraud. The foundation provided legal assistance, financial support, and counseling services to veterans who faced retaliation for doing the right thing. The foundation's first major success story came just 6 months after it was established. A Navy veteran named Lisa Rodriguez had discovered that her employer, a shipbuilding company, was using substandard materials in vessels being built for the Coast Guard. When she reported the problem, she was fired and blacklisted from the industry. The Thompson Foundation provided Lisa with legal representation and financial support while she fought her wrongful termination case. More importantly, they helped expose the shipbuilding company's dangerous practices before any Coast Guard members were put at risk. Lisa not only won her case, but also received a congressional commendation for her courage in protecting America's maritime security. The foundation also worked to change laws and policies that affected veterans. They successfully lobbied for the Veterans Court Protection Act, which established specific protocols for how veterans should be treated in federal court proceedings. The law, which was signed by the president in a Rose Garden ceremony that David attended, ensured that no veteran would ever again face the humiliation that David had endured in Morrison's courtroom. But perhaps the most meaningful moment in David's journey toward justice came on a cold December morning at Arlington National Cemetery. He was there to attend the funeral of Command Sergeant Major Robert Johnson, a Vietnam veteran who had spent his final years advocating for veterans' rights. As David stood at attention in his dress uniform, watching the honor guard fold the American flag that had covered Johnson's casket, he reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day in Morrison's courtroom. The medals on his chest, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, all of his service ribbons felt heavier now, not with shame but with the weight of responsibility. A young soldier approached David after the ceremony. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old, and she had the look of someone who had recently returned from deployment. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "Are you David Thompson?" "I am," David replied. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "I'm stationed at Fort Campbell, and last month I discovered some problems with the body armor that was being delivered to our unit. Some of it was defective, and I was scared to report it because I thought I might get in trouble. But then I remembered what you did, how you stood up for what was right even when it cost you everything. So I reported the problem." She paused, looking nervous but determined. It turned out that the contractor was knowingly shipping defective armor to save money. If I hadn't spoken up, soldiers could have died. The company got shut down, and now we're getting proper equipment. I might have saved lives because you showed me what courage looks like. David felt tears forming in his eyes. This was why he had endured months of legal battles, financial stress, and public scrutiny. It wasn't for the settlement money or the vindication or even the changes to the law. It was for moments like this when one person's courage inspired another person to do the right thing. That evening, David returned home to Patricia and their children. The house was paid off now, thanks to the settlement, but more importantly, it was filled with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done the right thing no matter what the cost. David's bronze star and Purple Heart were displayed in a place of honor in their living room. But they were no longer just his medals. They had become symbols of something bigger, the idea that in America, truth and justice could still prevail, even when the odds seemed impossible. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Ms. Chen, the prosecutor, who had stood by him during those dark days in Morrison's courtroom. "David," she said, "I have some news I thought you'd want to hear. The Justice Department is launching a new task force to investigate defense contractor fraud, and they want you to head up the Veteran Outreach Program. Are you interested?" David looked at his medals gleaming in the evening light and thought about all the soldiers who were still serving overseas, depending on equipment and supplies that honest contractors would provide, because people like him had stood up to the dishonest ones. "When do I start?" he asked. The next morning, David put on his dress uniform one more time. But this time he wasn't going to court as a defendant or even as a witness. He was going to work as a federal employee again, serving his country in a new way, but with the same commitment to honor and integrity that had guided him through 15 years of military service. As he pinned his medals to his chest, David smiled. Judge Morrison had tried to take away his dignity by forcing him to remove these symbols of his service. Instead, Morrison had given David something even more valuable, the opportunity to prove that courage, integrity, and justice were more powerful than corruption, intimidation, and abuse of power. The medals caught the morning sunlight streaming through his bedroom window, and David Thompson walked out into a world where truth had triumphed and justice had been served. It had taken 6 months, cost him everything he had built in his civilian career, and put his family through tremendous stress, but it had been worth every single day.